Hello. Welcome. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. And I want to welcome you to this wonderful evening in the spirit of David Halberstam, someone I both knew and admired, and is a great person to inspire a talk about journalism in every respect. Talk about it from the perspective of idealism, professionalism, high quality, passion, all of those things. I'm very glad that I know that the class of 1955 is David's class is well represented here and is co-sponsor of this with the Harvard Crimson. Is there anyone else who is a co-sponsor that I should mention? If so, shout out. But I also want to say how very pleased I am that David Halberstam's widow and daughter are here, Jean and Julia Halberstam. Please join me in that. David Halberstam, as I know all of you probably know, was a graduate of Harvard in 1955. He was the managing editor of the Crimson. But he was also a significant figure in American journalism in a different kind of sense. He was really the beginning of a new kind of American journalism. Highly educated, idealistic, committed in a kind of a social way to being a journalist in order to use journalism to tell truths that would have the effect of making this a better place. It's not that journalists in the past, before David Halberstam's time, were not, rooted in many cases in idealism. It's that he was someone who really looked at journalism as a profession that was suitable to a guy who went to Harvard. That was very unusual in its time. David Halberstam graduated in '55. He went to the smallest daily newspaper in Mississippi to begin his journalism career covering civil rights. He then went to the Nashville Tennessean, and he then went to the New York Times in 1962. I want to tell you a story about that because I think it really gets at something that is very much the point of the spirit of David Halberstam and also what journalism, I believe, is really all about. Let me take you back. David Halberstam went to Mississippi to cover civil rights. And what he found was a situation that was morally repugnant. But what was really also important was that he found that the enemy was, in this particular case, often the government. That was a big change. The government, the generations before of journalists in the United States, especially during World War II, had looked at themselves as allies, as partners even, of journalists. Journalists wore uniforms during World War II. And David Halberstam and his contemporaries cut their teeth in a world in which they were actively answering back to government power and often criticizing it. He went to Vietnam in 1962 and was in Saigon, one of the very few American newspaper or journalists of any kind, full-time in Saigon, and began sending back reports about what he really saw and what he could learn. And this was something that was very, very unhappy to the J.F. Kennedy administration, to Jack Kennedy, who was president at that time. While this was happening, at the New York Times, a man named Punch Sulzberger had become publisher in the spring of 1963. He was not supposed to become publisher. He was considered to be much too inexperienced, much too sort of unpolished. He was not a man who was thought to be ready. But nevertheless, his brother-in-law died and he became publisher. And he was now, in 1963, trying to figure out how to be publisher. And what the publisher of the New York Times, who was Punch Sulzberger, an ex-Marine from World War II, a very patriotic man, but a man who'd barely gotten through college. What was he going to do as publisher? he got an invitation in October of 1963 to come to the White House. He and Scotty Reston, who was the legendary White House, the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, were invited to come to lunch. And Punch was both awed and proud. So he goes to the White House, and they walk in, and there's Jack Kennedy using all of his, the power of the White House and everything else to sort of overwhelm this young publisher. And he begins immediately to tell Punch that he's got to get rid of David Halberstam. David Halberstam is too close to the story. He's not objective. You've got to replace him. You've got to withdraw him. You've got to get him out of there. And it was apparently one of these kinds of lectures. And Punch kind of got, a full snootful of this and basically said, and I'm using the vernacular here, but in effect he said, Mr. President, you can go piss up a rope. And marched out of the White House with Scotty Reston back to the Washington bureau and called David Halberstam and canceled his vacation, which had been planned, because he was afraid that it would be interpreted as acquiescing to the presidency. And Scotty Reston was so proud of him. He felt like this was the moment when really Punch Sulzberger came of age. So flash forward 30 years. 30 years. This was important because the fact that the New York Times backed David effectively made it possible for the AP and other news organizations to do the same. They set the tone. The tone was, tell it like it is. 30 years later, the New Yorker magazine is sort of celebrating the Pulitzer Prize-winning Vietnam journalists. And 5 of these, Peter Arnett, David, Neil Sheehan, there were 5 people who'd won Pulitzer Prizes for their Vietnam coverage, went at the end of this day to Elio's, a restaurant on the Upper East Side in New York, which is kind of a media hangout, to tell war stories and drink and congratulate each other for living 30 years after Vietnam and how great they were. I'm sure there was some of that. And they looked, and there in the restaurant was Punch with a group of people. And David told me this story himself. He said, I looked over, and we talked about it, and we realized that what we did could not have been done without Punch. And so we wanted to tell him that we appreciated it. And so the group of them, 5 Pulitzer Prize-winning Vietnam War correspondents, sent Punch and his table a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne. My point is this. This was a time of David Halberstam's, and it was a time of the New York Times. And we are here tonight to talk about journalism as he experienced it, journalism as this group and I'm also a journalist as far as I'm concerned, as we know it, and also journalism for a new generation, a generation that is now coming along and facing a different world, a world of its own with its own challenges and difficulties, but with the issue of journalism and the pleasures and joys of it very much still the same. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists, but before I do, I want you to look at a brief clip of David Halberstam talking about journalism.
Understood was it wasn't about being popular. I didn't care where Washington liked me, or even my editors, who were made sometimes nervous. What was important was that my readers, if the VC walked into Saigon one day, which I thought was going to happen sooner or later, not be surprised. That was my mission, just to let my readers know. And that I understood something else, which was that I was only 28 years old when I went there. I understood that I was heir of a great tradition, that by chance history had catapulted me to a moment where journalism mattered. That there are moments, there are a lot of stories, terrific stories, you have a great time. Civil rights movement, and journalism mattered in the civil rights movement because this was a country trying to define itself for a modern era and coming out of a feudal past. But in Vietnam it mattered as well because the government was lying. When the government doesn't tell the truth, then the power of journalism goes up.
we have a distinguished panel. I want to introduce them, and then we're going to have a conversation, first with ourselves, and then later, we hope, with many of you. So without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished panel. To your right, far right, is Charlie Sennott, who is one of the founders, executive editor, and vice president of globalpost.com, which is a new, and I mean very new, a new online international news site that is devoted to international news alone. Charlie comes from a very distinguished background as a globe-trotting foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe. He would have probably still been at the Boston Globe if in 2006 the Globe had not effectively abolished all of its international reporting, which is one of the problems that we have today. Charlie had the idea that there was interest out there in international news, and he and Phil Balboni, his partner in founding Global Post, put it together. It has been, as a for-profit venture, this is something that has been underway for less than 2 years. It's already won incredible recognition and awards. Next to him is Martha Raddatz. Martha is I think your title at this moment is Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent of ABC News, but the fact is that Martha has been one of ABC News' most distinguished reporters for many years, and she has spent a lot of that time going to places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and doing the kind of journalism and reporting that David Halberstam represented and loved. She has won awards. One of the ones that she won that I suspect means a lot to her is one in the name of Daniel Pearl. Daniel Pearl, you may remember, was the Wall Street Journal reporter who was kidnapped by militants and then executed and assassinated, murdered. He represented the danger and the complexity of the world that journalists who are in these dangerous places face. And Martha has been not only the White House correspondent and senior foreign affairs correspondent for ABC, as I say, but she has been all over the world and has done, the shoe leather kind of reporting that is at the heart of the spirit of David Halberstam, I would say. And next to me is Stephen Engelberg, a colleague of mine from my time at the New York Times and his time at the New York Times. He is an investigative reporter's investigative reporter. He has spent his career essentially as an investigative reporter at the Times, at the Oregonian in Portland, and now he is the managing editor of ProPublica, which is the most watched and admired and worried about nonprofit venture for investigative journalism. It again is a different model from the other two. This is a nonprofit model focused on investigative reporting. Steve is also, as I say, won many awards. This is a very distinguished group. I told them before the program began, when we were back in the green room, that I wanted them to talk briefly before we get into the investigative reporting aspects of this. I wanted to do something that journalists don't often do. I wanted them to talk about what it felt like. These are people like David who have given their entire careers to journalism. David was killed in an automobile accident on his way to interview someone. I mean, that was his life, and that was his life right up into the very end of his life. All of these folks have done the same with the time they have had. They have made their careers journalism. And I wanted them to talk about, very quickly, why they became a journalist, but more importantly, what, from their experience at its best, journalism feels like. What it feels like. Charlie?
I think there are a couple of different key experiences you have. One is when you find that you've got that piece of information that's going to break that story wide open. The other one is being in the right place at the right time. And you often have to work really hard to be in the right place at the right time. For me, the reason I came into journalism was, my family had a house painting business, and my oldest brother, had a job nights as a photographer for the Boston Herald. And I would go and run his film for him. And I wouldn't get very long to do this, but for a few minutes I could kneel courtside and watch the Celtics. Just for a minute. And I thought, I always want to be courtside. I want to be a journalist. And I think the experience of having done this for the paper I grew up reading, the Boston Globe, which I love to this day, and I always wanted to work there, was to see these great journalists, that tradition that David talks about in the clip, of feeling heir to something, feeling heir to a really proud legacy of the guys who fought hard to be there. And for me, that was really, a career of trying to break stories and be there at the right place at the right time. Being in Afghanistan in 2001, being in Iraq in 2003, covering those stories really captured that you can't call it a joy, but I think that David summed it up perfectly when he said, it's that moment where history catapults you into a place where journalism matters.
Well,
and I think we got that.
But do talk about that moment that you were just describing. When you're doing an interview and someone says something and you know.
Yeah, you got them.
Well, you have the story.
Yeah, well, I think, I worked with Ben Bradley at the Boston Globe, who was really, truly a fantastic editor. And I remember the glee with which I could call him up, Ben Bradley Jr. I could call him up and tell him what I got. Covering the Big Dig, I began going out drinking with a lot of engineers. And there was this thing called the 9A contract
Journalism.
that I kept hearing about. And I just remember this moment of being with a whole bunch of engineers who were chatting about this thing called the 9A contract. And knowing that this is where the story is, because one of them had let slip that there was no way this was going to work, and this was going to cost at least $500 million in a screw-up. And knowing I got the place where I need to go to find that contract, to look at Bechtel and the design specs and say, I got it. And I think that informational got it is one feeling. But I think another one that's equally powerful is the sense that you are in the moment. You're on a story, you've worked hard to get there. And I had that feeling very intensely in Afghanistan in 2001, that I had covered what was nascent al-Qaeda for 8 years, from the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, when I was a street reporter for the New York Daily News, and really was just covering it like a cop story. And we had a great city editor, Billy Boyle, who sent me to Egypt and then to Pakistan and the West Bank to follow the suspects. Cop reporting. And then you fast forward to that moment of September 11th, where you've covered that for 8 years as a cop reporter, and now you're going to Afghanistan to cover what will be, the world has changed, an extraordinary moment for our country, and a war that will last a long time. And that was the moment for me of that sense of history bringing you to a place where journalism matters.
Martha?
Okay, why I got into journalism, this is always a little bit embarrassing for me because I really I wasn't like you. I wasn't looking at people thinking, I want to do that. I really was kind of a loser. And I was drinking like too much beer and playing too much pool in college. And then I kind of fell into it. And when I fell into it and when I started working at the lowest possible levels at a television station, I instantly loved it. And we were talking a little bit before we came out here. My now 29-year-old daughter worked for a short time after college at News Channel 8 here. And she would call and say, Mom, I don't love this story.
That's a local television news.
It's a local, and she wasn't on air, she was writing, and she said, the story today was so boring, and I thought, you're not cut out for it. I mean, I didn't say that, but I said, you know what? I loved every story I covered, and I really did. And I think it's this disciplined curiosity that you're telling stories, and to me, that's really the important part of my job. And it's what I always say to journalism students. You know what? You really can't go on the news and say, this happened, this happened, this happened. You have to tell people why it mattered. You have to be excited about it yourself. I'll say a couple of moments for me that were exciting, and they're all very different. And you talk about the interview where you say, okay, that's going to make news. I traveled with Vice President Cheney several years ago, And it was a kind of a nothing trip. I got sort of thrown in on this trip and had not traveled with the vice president, and I don't think the vice president really loved having press along anyway. He really literally never said hello to us, and we're on the same airplane. And I can't tell you how tense these interviews are with public figures, whether it's the president or the vice president or the secretary of state. You have 20 minutes and they are giving you flashcards. And you want to drill down into some subject, but you know if you just stay on that, which they'd love you to do, to chew up all the time, you won't get what you want to talk to. And so Vice President Cheney is sitting there, and he, as you know, he's just quite the presence. And he's just kind of looking at me through, and I said, you know, Vice President Cheney, 2/3 of Americans say the war wasn't worth fighting. And he looked up at me and said, so?
Oh,
And
that's a good moment.
and it
true.
was, and I was honestly just stunned. And, you know I'm on camera, I know I have to react, and I think I just said back to him, so, does that matter? And he stayed right with it, and that moment became quite the news story for quite a while. So those interviews, or during the time that I covered the White House, the interviews were, to me, I guess what I'm proudest of over the years, and have covered the wars, both of them, since they began, sometimes from the Pentagon, a lot of times overseas, is that during the period when Iraq was truly in danger, and that the National Intelligence estimates said they were in the midst of a civil war, and the administration was saying, everything's fine. It's going to be a success. Everything's going well. Now, I know since the surge it's been going a lot better, but at this time it was not going well at all. I was traveling there a lot. It was great because I was a White House correspondent, but I was still able to go overseas and then come back and face the president. And remember asking him once if he thought it was a civil war, if he agreed with his national intelligence estimate. And he, no kidding, looked at me and said, you know, it's hard for me to say, living in this big, beautiful White House, you've been there, I haven't been. And that was another time I sat stunned. But during that period, I think day after day with the administration saying it's going just fine, but every night the American public being exposed to what was actually happening, I think the American public figured it out. And it didn't mean we went on the air and said, everything's really terrible, everything's horrible, they're liars. It was that we went on the air every night and said, look, I'm here, and I just got mortared, and I just got rocketed, and that may be a soda straw view, but I've talked to a whole lot of people, and here is what they are saying. And to me, day after day after day of doing that, and having the American public figure that out, and President Bush understanding that they needed to change strategy. They needed to do something different. And frankly, that was a pretty courageous move to say, I know everybody's saying get out of there, but I'm gonna double down on this one and send in more troops. And certainly the security situation improved dramatically. And one tiny little final one, as we talked about this too, is reporters really never get calls in the middle of the night. You just, I mean, you know, it's the old-fashioned, yeah, sure, you know, you're on the phone all day, and, you know, they'll call you when something big happens. No one really ever calls you when something big happens. But when Zarqawi was captured in Iraq, and he was the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq, I got the great phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, and how that felt to me was, oh my gosh, not tonight, I'm too tired. And because I was actually writing a book at the time, I had worked all day covering the White House, I went home, my head had just hit the pillow at 2 a.m., and I got a call, and the caller said, they got him. And I said, what? They got who? They got who? And calls in the middle of the night are never good. It's always something bad, or they're calling you to do Good Morning America, which means you have to get up in 2 hours. So that was actually one of those moments that was, I can't believe I've just gotten this huge story. I mean, it was great, like the New York Times wrote about it, that we'd gotten this scoop. So it feels good, but what feels greatest is really telling a story. And I love it when people come up to me and they don't say, hey, I saw you on TV. They say, I remember that story you did in Iraq, or I remember that story you did in Afghanistan. And that, to me, is the meaningful, wonderful thing about my job.
Great. Steve?
All right, well, I stumbled into this business as well. I was a very odd college freshman. I showed up knowing exactly what I wanted to major in and do, and it most certainly was not journalism. I was going to be a historian, and I knew it on freshman week that that's what I was going to go to college and do and go to graduate school. And along the way, I got sidetracked into this journalism thing and had some internships and so on, and I really just sort of totally fell in love with it and decided, given a choice between writing a kind of very rough history and writing a history where you could ask follow-up questions or you couldn't ask follow-up questions, I'd rather actually interview the people I was writing about. But I think it was a deeper thing than that. A little bit of personal background. I'm a first-generation American. My father was a Jewish refugee from Germany. And I think as I've thought about it over the years, the choice of career wasn't so coincidental. I think in my heart, I've always believed that if people only knew the truth, if people had put in their hands the actual facts, the important facts, the things that were being hidden, there would be a different outcome. People talk about the bias of journalists. For my money, most journalists are really reformers. They believe that the public really will, democracy really will make a good decision if only they know. And so our job is to actually communicate that. The story, I give two very quick examples. I was working at the New York Times Washington Bureau in the late 1980s, and there was a lot of sort of very general speeches saying that the Libyans were building a chemical weapons factory, and they had gotten support from European countries, and that was it. And everybody said, oh, well, that's terrible. Gaddafi shouldn't have chemical weapons. And I decided I was going to find out who was doing this, who specifically. And I went and I asked everybody I knew in Washington to tell me, and they all said, you're out of your mind, it's classified, I'm not going to tell you. I remember talking to one guy who I knew it, and I said, well, come on now, Bill, give me the name. And he said, I can't do that. I said, okay, well, what letter does it start with? And he said, you're out of your mind. I said, okay, split the alphabet in half, 1 through 13, 14 through 26. Where does it sit? And he said, no, not a word. So I then began going everywhere I could, and everybody threw me out of their offices. And I finally walked into the office of a guy I'd never met before, who was in the State Department, and who wasn't working on this anymore, but he had worked on it. And I'd never met the man. And I said, well, look, it would be enormously important if people knew who this was. He said, oh, I think that's right. You'd be surprised yourself. And I said, well, do you remember the name? And he said, you know, it's been a year. I really can't. Let me just think for a minute. And there was this silence, and I could feel my heart beating. And I was sitting there saying, come on. And he said, okay, look, it's a German company, and it's something like Einhausen. I said, how would you spell that? He says, I don't know, E-I-N-H-A-U-S-E-N, Einhausen. I don't speak German, he says to me, I don't know. So I went back and I called the New York Times bureau in Berlin. It was Christmas time. The correspondent, Serge Schmidle, had gone home, and there was just this kid who was a German, very good English speaker, very energetic, Tom Seibert. And I said, well, Tom, we're looking for a company that makes pesticides, because that's where the chemical weapons, you can make either pesticides or chemical weapons. I said, they're German. They probably came across hard times financially about 5 years ago, but they're looking pretty good right now, and they must have a contract somewhere. And about 3 hours later, he called me at home, and he said, I think I have something. I said, yeah, what's the name? He said, is it Einhausen? He said, no, it's not Einhausen. There's no Einhausen. He said, but there is an Imhausen. I said, really? He said, yes. And he said, they have this contract, and 5 years ago, they were almost bankrupt, and now they're very flush. I said, well, I think we should call this man. He said, who's Imhausen? He said, yes, Jürgen Hippenstiel Imhausen. I said, well, you should call Jürgen and let's ask him about this. And we actually interviewed this guy, and he turned out to be the guy. And his denials were really quite amazing. He even said that he had Jewish family, and that's why he would never do this to his own people. But in fact, he had done this. And so myself and Michael Gordon broke this story, and Bill Safire wrote a column, the headline of which, I must say, did send the Germans into absolute orbit, and it created this international sensation, and it was all ultimately all true. The headline was, Auschwitz in the sand.
Ooh. So how did it feel when you got that word, Imhausen?
It was an indescribable moment, and I think the second indescribable moment was when we sat down at the State Department with barely anything and played poker with them and absolutely bluffed them into the whole thing, because I I went to this meeting. My friend Michael Gordon covered arms control, and he said 2 of the guys I cover actually know this. So we sat down, and he said, "This is Steve Engelberg, my colleague. He covers the CIA." And I looked at him and I said, I looked at these 2 guys and I said, "Well, look, we have the story. We know all about it. It's Imhausen. Imhausen is the spider in the web. We're just trying to fill out what the web is." In fact, all we had was the name. And the guys looked at me and said, "Did you get a briefing from the CIA about this?" And I said, "Look, I don't discuss my sources." I wouldn't talk about our conversation. And at that point, they said, "Well, did they tell you about the State Department role?" I said, "Well, nobody really said anything about diplomacy." And they said, "Well, we're running this whole thing. This is not them, it's us." And at that point, they began to lay out in enormous detail things we knew nothing about, all of which turned out to be true. And I thought that was the moment where I thought, oh my, this is really something.
But you know, it can also be
Sure.
terrifying. I think all of you guys would agree with that. There's that moment right before it goes to print or right after you've been on the air and you're like, oh man, I hope this is right.
hope this one's right, yeah.
I hope this is, I mean, even if you have the most golden of sources, there is a moment when it's absolutely terrifying.
On that story, that moment came because, you know, people visualize Washington as a place where leaks are handed to you. So finally, we get the story nailed down. I have the story sitting in a printout, and I went to see a very senior advisor, the chief of intelligence of the State Department, and I said, "Look, we have the story. Is there anything you'd like to add?" And he said, "No, we're taking hands off on this thing." Then the story broke, and the Germans started off by denying it, and the State Department wouldn't say anything. And at one point, we went to the State Department spokesman, and we said, "Look, you know this is true." And he said, "You made this mess, you can get out of it." and I thought to myself at that moment, are we sure? Is it right? Is it right?
The title of this conversation tonight is "In the Spirit of David Halberstam." And I'd like you to talk. Steve, why don't you start us? You know, you are the managing editor of an organization that was created in a kind of sense of desperation for investigative reporting. It was created because a couple in California were willing to endow for at least 3 years, now more, I think, investigative reporting because the perception was that it was genuinely in jeopardy. And when the existence of this was announced and the call went out for people who might be interested, Paul Steiger, who's the top editor, who was the former editor of the Wall Street Journal, said, I remember I was talking to him about it here one night, and he said, you know, it's actually very discouraging because we're getting overwhelmed with applications from very, very good journalists at places like the Los Angeles Times, and it was dispiriting because they were prepared to leave jobs like those at the Los Angeles Times to come to what is still something that may or may not survive for very long, we just don't know, but was certainly not the platform that the Los Angeles Times at least had been. My question to you is, you are probably the top model of nonprofit journalism right now. What do you see in terms of the likelihood of the survivability of this kind of reporting that you've done, you've spent your life at, that David Halberstam embodied?
Well, I mean, first of all, of course, investigative reporters are optimists. I mean, you have to believe that if you actually keep, banging at this locked box, it will actually contain something. So I'm an optimist. And I think in the long, long run, investigative reporting will flourish because I think ultimately what we're seeing in this sort of revolution in the newspaper and journalism and media business is that original, unique content is what people want. And so I think there ultimately will be a commercial argument for finding things out that nobody else knows. And I certainly hope that's the case. But I think you can make a real commercial argument for it. So I think in the long run, when we get through this quite ugly transition, there's great hope. The transitional period that we're in right now is a very ugly one.
Is your prospective sort of choice of who you have the ability to hire, if you had the money to hire, still as overwhelming as it was when ProPublica was announced?
It's a little bit less than it was, and it's interesting why. In many arenas, I would say, we got 1,300 resumes when we started, and we've gotten many more since, so that was for 18 jobs. So it really was
But
overwhelming.
these are real jobs. These were, the thing about ProPublica that mattered, it made it so appealing, was that these were jobs that were paying a living wage, that was going to create a newsroom. It was going to be, it's in New York, and it was going to be something that was genuinely for real. It was not a hopeful startup. It was something that was really going to be well funded, at least as long as the funders didn't get mad.
And so far, so good. I will say the one arena where it's changed a little bit, and it is interesting because it does reflect a business model issue. In the world of financial journalists right now, when we are competing with, say, Reuters and Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg, all of which in different ways are very, very well funded, we're always the low offer by a mile. And we've still managed to get some people in the financial world. But I would say financial journalism is probably a little bit healthier. But that's because Bloomberg and Reuters actually have a different kind of thing where they're charging companies for information as well as producing journalism. So,
Martha, you're from the world of traditional media, commercial media, a for-profit media, a media that is, in many ways endangered. ABC as a network may not be. ABC News, who knows? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm asking you. When you were talking now, I mean, David Halberstam represented the beginning of a generational change. He's talked about the great tradition that he was sort of part of, but I would say that he and his generation sort of established a tradition, one that was willing to take on government in a way that had not been generally true of the commercial, mainstream media in the past. And we're members of that succeeding generation, and the folks from the Crimson and other students here tonight are people who represent yet another generation. What do you think ABC News has to say to a generation that's coming on, if they're interested in careers in investigative reporting, for instance?
First of all, ABC News has an investigative unit, which is great, and really all the networks do at this point. And I think one of the things the networks realize is that if you don't have an investigative unit, you're really not a real news organization. That really defines you. It helps define a new news organization, that they'll put that kind of money into investigative units. I mean, one of the things about, you all know well about investigative reporting, sometimes it doesn't pan out. And you may have just invested a whole lot of money and a whole lot of time into something that didn't happen, that you didn't find out what you thought you might find out. There was no villain, there was no one doing anything wrong, or at least that's what you found out. I think everybody in journalism today is worried because we're in this incredible transition. As far as and I can't tell you how many younger people come up to me and say, I want to be a foreign correspondent someday just like you. And
Please have them call Global Post.
yeah, yes, I will. And I love that the appeal is still there. I love that someone can look at what I do or what Charlie does and say, and all his young fabulous staff who I've run into overseas all the time, and they always ask the best questions. They really do. Because they live there, so they really know what to ask. But I think, to me, the networks offer, in all the white noise and in all the journalism that's out there, I think it's more difficult for people to figure out where to turn. Maybe it's my generation, but I think it's difficult to figure out what's important. I mean, even if you go to the New York Times on the internet, if we have the paper in front of us, and I'm doing that less and less, quite frankly, and reading it more and more on the internet. But if in the old days, that story on the right is the most important story that you should read. And when I told my children growing up that all they had to do was read the first paragraph of every story except one on the front page, and they had to read the whole thing. Didn't work out that well, but I tried. But that story on the right was the story that was most important. I look at the internet at night, and 1 hour it's this, the next hour it's that, and the next hour it's that. So I think I worry about that for a generation that doesn't quite know what's important, doesn't quite know what the vegetables are, and that there's so many choices. I mean, trust me, I go on our website, and I'm reading about Lindsay Lohan too. But and I don't want to say that people don't. I mean, there's so many stories to tell, and some of them are entertainment stories, some of them are foreign policy stories, some of them are political stories, but you need a little bit of all of them. But I think what the networks offer, and people forget this, is that we have 8 million viewers every night. And that's a pretty astonishing number still. That may have decreased dramatically as other news media increases, but we still have 8 million viewers. And I think what we can offer, and that the networks are kind of one of the last bastions where you, despite what everyone says about mainstream media and we're horrible, I frankly think it's the most objective news you can get on television, and you can tune in and you can watch World News or Brian Williams' show, and you get 22 minutes of the day's news. And there are very few places you can go in that economy of time to get the day's news. And that's what I hope we stay with. I know sometimes all the networks think, oh my gosh, we have to do a different model because we're losing viewers. But I think, to me, the most attractive thing about what we do is that we present what happened on a daily basis on those programs. I mean, we're exploring all kinds of, we have this very cool iPad, globe that you can spin, and you can find stories, and you can find archived stories and all that. And that's great, and I do that all the time too, and look at that. But boy, if I miss the evening news, and I frankly look at all of them when I get home, just spinning through them, I think you're really missing out on being a citizen, and you're really not informing yourself. And I really worry about that. I worry about that there's a generation that doesn't know what the important stuff is, and that you're losing a professional class that has invested their lives in figuring out what the important stuff is. And that's not meant to sound arrogant that, oh, I know this is what you should read, but we do this for a living, and we try to interest people in what is important.
Charlie, you represent another model still, which is a startup model, but it is a for-profit startup model, and it's focused on news, which is, there are a lot of web startups, but there are very, very few that are as ambitious or as sort of serious-minded as Global Post. Talk about what the conviction and the optimism was that inspired Global Post, and what it is now.
So Global Post starts as this split screen here in Boston. I have been working at the Boston Globe. I've just had a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard. I've come off of 10 years full-time as a foreign correspondent. I've covered Iraq, I've covered Afghanistan. I feel like I've reached that moment where this work really matters, and it's that moment at which the Boston Globe pulls the plug on its foreign operation and decides they're no longer going to have any international news. I'm feeling very sad about this great institution that I love. I know the people who had to make those decisions are sad too, but something's going to have to be born out of this. So I begin to do what I think a lot of journalists would do, which is to think about starting a not-for-profit. Because those of us, I think I have a real entrepreneurial streak, but I don't have that business skill. And I'm thinking, I would love to get $30 million. I would love to get a huge grant. I know I can pull the team together. Where can I get the money? I start with a not-for-profit model. I am doing this while my 4 sons are pounding above me on the floorboards in my little basement office, and I'm thinking, I can't leave the Boston Globe unless I really have funding. And I learned that it's very hard to build a not-for-profit. It's very difficult. At just about the moment I'm approaching despair, I come see you and others who I was putting together a advisory board, and several of you mentioned that I might want to talk to someone else in town here who has another model, which is a for-profit model, and that was Phil Balboni, who is the founder of New England Cable News. Phil had and Martha's old boss, and really had a business plan of how he felt he could do this. And it made a lot of sense to me, and he shared it with me. And I think he saw in me someone who had the contacts and the network to build that team. We shared an editorial vision of what we wanted it to be. We were right in sync. And he invited me to come in with him as a co-founder. He had lined up a lot of the investment, and we were able to go forward and do this startup. So that was 2008, I left the Boston Globe on St. Patrick's Day 2008, and we launched Global Post in January of 2009. We launched with 0 traffic. We're now getting past a big milestone of 1 million uniques per month, which is how you do the metric on the web. So that's 1 million people who every month come to our site. And there's a great engaged audience that's there. We have now about 65 correspondents on contract in about 50 countries. We have about 100 correspondents in total who are writing for us all the time. And they're all over the world. And they are a mix of really young people who are getting their first shot at being a foreign correspondent. They are mid-career veterans who find themselves sort of crashed on the rocks of the collapse of establishment journalism. And they are also wonderful veterans who've been around a long time, like David Greenway, HDS Greenway, writes a column for us. David goes from Hue to Fallujah, and he's going to Afghanistan for us this month. That's 50 years of experience in David. We have some with 20 years, we have some with 2 years, but we have this team that's a little bit like herding cats. They're all over the place, but I think what binds them together is a sense of that tradition that David Halberstam talked about. Halberstam was part of something that I'm sad to say no longer exists, and that is the idea that you can start at a small paper in the Deep South covering an important story on a local level, and then you get to the Tennessean, and then you get your big shot at the big city paper. That's what I did. I went to the Bergen Record. I covered Hudson County, Jersey City. I looked across at New York City. Then I finally got to the New York Daily News. Then I got lucky enough to go from the New York Daily News to the Boston Globe. That journey of going from one paper to the next is largely over. For the younger, for the students here who are at the Crimson, who really want to take on this career, it's going to be a different path for you. And what we're trying to do at Global Post is say, we want to be about the next generation of foreign correspondents. We really want to start a new kind of model that's basically a freelance model and says, here's a shot. Here's a shot to go off to a country where you have some facility for the language and you need to live there. It's an absolute prerequisite of ours that you live in the place about which you write, because that's the only way you can really get at those stories. So we're trying to create something new that can replicate the experience that David Halberstam had, which is to get that moment that every foreign correspondent is waiting for, which is that intersection when history, as he put it, catapults you to a moment when journalism matters. And that, you don't know when that's going to happen, but I think that's the thing everyone is out there looking for. And the more people we have in the world trying to do that, the more eyeballs we have in the world, I think the better we are as a country. And we need to start to build these new models, because we can't let the great traditions of journalism die. We've got to start thinking about rebuilding.
I know you wanted to talk about a particular story that just appeared on Global Post that will help people understand what Global Post does. Can we put up the visual of this? Explain what we're looking at here, Charlie.
This is a story that we did actually last summer. And what we've been trying to do at Global Post is to think about how we can stay with a story, but also create an environment of understanding that takes you in depth. So this is a history of the Taliban. This reflects, I started covering the Taliban in 1996 because the then foreign editor of the Boston Globe, John Yema, sent me and said, there's this new movement. They're called the Taliban. Go check them out. Seamus Murphy, a fantastic photographer, started covering it at the same time, and we've known each other for a long time. This was a journey back to understand that. But there was one story that neither Seamus nor myself broke that was inside this series. And that was by Gene McKenzie, who is our Kabul correspondent. Gene and I were having lunch at L'Atmosphere in Kabul, big NGO hangout. This kind of swarthy NGO guy walks past, gives her a hug, and she said, oh, that guy, has a contract where they actually have to pay the Taliban protection money. So I sort of dropped my fork and say, excuse me? And Gene said, yeah, everyone knows that. And I said, Gene, no, they don't. Check, please. we literally started reporting the story, and Jean began to really dig in on this story, and she didn't break it perfectly. This was not sort of a spotlight Boston Globe 6-month investigation, but she got the first story out that said, USAID gives hundreds of millions of dollars a year. That gets funneled to contractors and then subcontractors. When it gets to the subcontractor level, that's where they're Afghan contractors. And those subcontractors are absolutely paying off the Taliban for protection. It's a protection racket with a straight 20% off the contract. We began to do the math on that. We began to see that we're now talking about like potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, certainly scores of millions of dollars. And we began to think this is just a huge story. Now, we don't at Global Post have all the resources we need to get that story. You know, partnering with ProPublica or getting more funding to take us deeper is what we need to think about if we're going to really get those kinds of stories. But we know we have the people in place who can find them. And what we did is we got it far enough downfield that USAID began to investigate. And the next screen, if you can show, is just this came out last week. USAID spent 1 year on an audit. They did give us that, wasn't a call in the middle of the night, but it was a nice phone call that said, hey, the report's out, and we're giving it to you first. And it basically confirmed our reporting that the Taliban is taking a 20% cut off of Afghan subcontractors in Afghanistan. One contract was $5 million that the Taliban took.
So we're paying the people who
So
are killing soldiers.
our tax dollars going to the Taliban. That story really resonated. It got us on a lot of attention. And I think at Global Post, we're trying to find the way that we can do those kinds of stories now. And that's really become a focus I'm trying to go in now. We have the daily running. We can keep that daily machine going with great feature stories and great coverage done by people who really know it. But can we take it deeper? Can we do the stories that matter? Can we do the kind of stuff that Halberstam loved to do?
You know, the thing about what David Halberstam did was that he was a professional journalist, and he made a living, you know, modest one when he got out of college, living wage at the New York Times. Then he left the Times and began writing books, and he made the rest of his career effectively as a book writer, a journalist who wrote books,
Right.
big books, long books, and very highly regarded books. My point is this. You've talked about a new model. The appeal of ProPublica was that it paid a living wage. You've made a career, and you've had a daughter, and you've paid a mortgage, and you've lived a life based on being paid in a way that allowed you to be a professional journalist. There's a lot of thought now that professional journalism may genuinely be an endangered concept. Is it important?
Well, first of all, yes, it's important. Absolutely, it's important. I mean, I think that one of the things that we have, the initial rush when the internet began destroying the business model side of it is people said, it ain't going to be so bad because we'll have crowdsourcing. The crowd will go investigate things. And it turns out that if the crowd were that good at reporting, they'd already be reporters. Crowds of people don't actually find that much out, and the crowdsourcing thing has been a great disappointment. Now, I do believe that the future will bring us more stability. I mean, I think we can't overstate how much of a transitional period this is. Just a couple of very quick facts for the audience. When I worked at the Oregonian, we were a newspaper that before the internet was gaining 50% of our revenue, half of our dollars, from classified advertising. And our business model was a very simple one. You want to sell your car? Give us $100 now. And by the way, you have to type it. And what could be a better kind of model than that? And we would say, if you don't like that, you can just not sell your car. And we were the only game in town. When Craigslist comes along, the effect that that has on the business side of things just cannot be underestimated. Now, down the road, yes, we made this, we all know this epical decision in the journalism business to give away our content for free. Got to be the dumbest idea I've ever heard of, but we did it, it's done, and now we're going to have to claw that back. And we will see, I think, over the next few years that people will begin charging small amounts of money to large numbers of people. What I'm saying is that I think the business will ultimately emerge in a way that we don't yet know. It will stabilize, and there will be living wages paid to professional people to find out information because people actually want it. I think they'll pay for it.
Well, but what about the talented amateurs, the people who graduate from Harvard and really have a passion for it? I mean, that seems to be being refreshed again and again. Is that going to be enough? Is there a real need for people who send a wife or send a kid to college and pay a mortgage from the profession of journalism?
First of all, I don't think the media has done a particularly good job of letting the American public know that what we do is important. I really don't. And I hope you're right about everything you just said, because I think we have sort of stood back and been stunned by all the changes. I mean, there are a lot of really smart people working on trying to keep up with this, but I think, in effect, the public doesn't understand the importance of journalism in many ways, and as I always say, you'll miss us when we're gone. And the content, and I'll talk to the young reporters here too. There is, to me, a new model of business person. I don't know if you guys know Nick Schmidle. Nick Schmidle is a young journalist who freelances for a living.
He's fantastic.
He's fantastic.
Oh my God, he's great.
And I first met Nick in Pakistan, and he moved to Pakistan with his wife, and they lived there for 2 years until they got thrown out and their visas pulled because he had written something in the New York Times that Musharraf did not like, or the ISI did not like, so their visas were revoked. But Nick and his wife Ricky have managed to get a house, pay a mortgage, and I mean, I think it's a harder model than perhaps what I went through, and I don't think any of us got in it for the money, but that steady job, one place, all the time. I think Nick is...
Working for the man is over.
Yeah, is an absolutely wonderful model. He loves what he's doing. He writes for New York Times Magazine all the time. I mean, because he's a talent. And if you're a talent and if you're a great journalist, you're going to do okay.
Now, this question, I do think this question matters a great deal, because if, and I do recall this, I had a very similar, I was listening to this thinking, wow, it's amazing. I had a very similar career to David Halberstam. I was a copy boy at the New York Times, carrying around pieces of paper back when we had typewriters. Yes, I was one of the last copy boys in America. I went to the Norfolk Virginian Pilot at age 22, and I was suddenly covering school busing as a person who had just recently, frankly, gotten out of high school, really, by any definition, right? And I didn't have any kids, I didn't have a family, I had no idea what it was like to be an adult in our society, and I was sitting there trying to interpret busing in the South to an entire community of people. I was way over my head. Nothing wrong with it. I think young people do a great job. I've put many young people as an editor into places where they were way over their head. But if newspapers are only people who don't have families, who are in their early 20s, and have no idea what the rest of life is like, I think newspapers will be poorer for it. I really do. I think that's great. I was one of those little guys, but I don't think it's enough.
But I also don't think Nick's, I mean, I think the young Nick Schmidles are going to grow into that
That's
model
what I'm saying.
as well. Yeah.
If they leave and nobody comes back, we really have a problem.
We're seeing a pretty interesting model develop. For example, if you see a young, very talented person, I'm going to give you one example. Nikki Cebecky, Tufts graduate. Nikki's a really talented photographer, and she's really well educated, and she can write. She can't write, right out of the box the way someone who's been doing it for 10 years or so can write, but she has a gift. She has a gift as a photographer. She goes to Turkey for us, lives in Istanbul, and begins to unpack that place. Has an affinity for it, understands the history, begins to do it. She slowly starts sending back these photo essays that tell us things about Turkey that are really interesting. She begins to write well to the images by doing simple, reporting, interviews, quotes, building the story. She started slow. She's now getting really good. Now, we had to pay her in a way that probably wasn't that different than what David Halberstam made at that first newspaper he went to, where he made probably nothing, and he's taken a big shot, and he's trying to make his name. What we're seeing is these younger correspondents can begin to put together lives that are about writing books. They have their own blog. They can begin to freelance for other people. They can get some work doing freelance photography. It's a different life. It's a harder life. The idea of being the Boston Globe Middle East correspondent, living in Jerusalem, my family is well taken care of. I never owned a new car in my life until the Globe leased one. for me in Jerusalem. It was a stunningly generous way of telling you, go out and cover the world, the way the Boston Globe used to be able to afford to do it. It was the luckiest thing. It was the greatest job you could ever have, to be working for a big, great newspaper as a foreign correspondent, from my point of view at least. Now it's hard. If you guys want to do this, it's difficult. You're going to have to be your own brand. You have to be entrepreneurial. You have to think about where you want to take your career. You have to make good decisions. I would never let Nikki Cebecky go to Afghanistan or Iraq. There's no way she's ready for that. But she put herself in the region to understand it in a place where she can operate safely, where she can learn. That's a great strategic direction in which she sent her career. And I think if we're gonna get these startups like ours working, we're going to have to be really attentive to the needs of those correspondents. We're going to have to keep that esprit de corps, and there's a sort of obligation we hold to really make these correspondents feel like they're part of something. And that's, we're trying our best.
We're going to open it up now to your questions. I hope you're going to join us. There are mics here, up top and over here. If you would, make sure that what you say is in the form of a question. And also, if you would identify yourself. Yes, sir.
My name's Will.
Will, are you?
My wife is a student here. I'm actually a freelance journalist, kind of what Charles is talking about. Been trying to make my way for the last 4 years, living in India and Japan, and found very few people willing to pay more than $5 for an article, but it's besides the point. My question is about the coverage of Afghanistan, and I'm going to kind of ask Martha specifically because she's representing the networks. I worked in Afghanistan for a couple of weeks and wrote an article from there. And for the last 2 years, when you watch NBC News or ABC News, and I will say your stuff is much better than some of your competitors, Richard Engel specifically is pretty poor. But it's just not representative of what Afghanistan is. And all I see when I watch the news is I see either women getting picked on and victimized, which is true, or I see men that are Taliban and have a gun or are going to abuse their women. There's never any picture, there's never any reality of these Afghan men that are just normal like us.
Okay, so what's the question?
My question is, at what point does that get cut off? Because I don't think you're going to these countries and saying, I'm just going to show the Taliban, I'm just going to show the women. I imagine that you're probably putting something together that's much different than what actually reaches the airwaves. So when does it get cut off? When does it get edited? When does it get chopped down? Who's responsible for that? And how do you approach that to try to get the message across the reality of these areas?
One of the things I think is a problem with Afghanistan and coverage of Afghanistan is the country is really, really suffering from war fatigue. And I think
You mean our country?
Our country. That our country is suffering from war fatigue. And I think, and quite on war fatigue.
War fatigue.
And through 9 years of war, they feel, and probably we have covered these stories again and again and again. Now, I'll be really specific about your question. I think I'm in a unique position, so it's harder for me to say. I'm pretty much in charge of what I put on the air. And I often embed with the military. That is not the only view of Afghanistan, nor should it ever be. We have people who are based in Kabul, who get out as much as they can to see other things in Kabul. I mean, do I think everybody has a complete picture? I really don't. And, it's tough getting on the air with these stories. It is. It's very, very tough because throughout these years of people saying, oh, the networks only want to put on the blood and gore of war and these horrible things to make money. Trust me, when Afghanistan comes on, the TV goes off or changes channel. I mean, it's a very sad thing, and I don't think my bosses look at that and say, okay, we can't do Afghanistan. But it is really challenging for us to try to go out there and tell stories that make people care about it or show some normal life in Afghanistan. Now I also have to say that we're not over there, and we got this a bazillion times in Iraq. Well, why don't you cover the good news? Why don't you? Because frankly, covering Iraq, there wasn't a whole lot of good news. Sure, if you went to some areas, it was completely peaceful, but our troops weren't really there. Our troops were fighting, and that's the same in Afghanistan. I mean, I try more and more analysis when I come back. I don't like it to be based on, oh, I saw this one horrible thing, so the whole country is going to hell. I mean, I think you really have to talk to as many people as you can. You have to certainly talk about people who are living normally. But right now we're in a stage there where you really have to find, it's very difficult to figure out what's going on there. It really is.
I'd like to thank you for sharing your experience as well.
Who
as
are
I'm
you?
John Soylu from Turkey. I'm a freshman at the college, and I wanted to ask about the difficulties of your job. You've all worked overseas. Was there any point in your life when you were this close to saying, I'm done, I've had enough of this, I need to move on, but somehow you didn't? Can you share with us those very difficult moments?
Who wants to?
I'll start with one, and I'm sure Charlie's had 10. I had only three happy years as a foreign correspondent, and I do remember a moment when I was covering the war in Yugoslavia, which I'd gone to cover the birth of democracy, freedom, and the free market in Poland, and suddenly found myself crawling around cornfields in Serbia saying, how did this happen? I'm not one of these war correspondents, but I remember we had written about discovered a particularly awful massacre, and there were bodies stacked in an old age home, and the older people had been killed, and it was very bloody and very upsetting. And I called the desk, and they basically said you could have 14 inches inside. And I remember just losing it and saying, what is it you want here? We've got 100,000 refugees. I got bodies piled out back here. What is it going to take for you people to care about this? And I was thinking, this is crazy. Why am I doing this? And then I must say, I kind of stopped myself a few hours later and thought, well, then I'm just not doing my job. I mean, if they don't care, it's because I haven't made them care. And I kind of took it back on myself. But there was certainly a moment where I thought, and the word actually was Yugo fatigue. It wasn't war fatigue. So we've had enough Yugoslavia. We don't need to write this anymore. I'm sure Charlie's got a lot of frustration he could tell you about.
But I bet that's not the answers you were expecting. I bet you were sort of thinking we'd say, I'm done with this sort of thing. It's too dangerous or something. But probably all of us are.
Yeah.
The frustration is just not ever getting what you want or on the air or in the.
I think, the thing about what you said is that I love the way you came back to you need to work harder. I mean, I think if there's anything that I take from David Halberstam's history and the work he did is how hard he worked. This is something that I really worry about younger correspondents who don't have all these opportunities, and they're so busy putting together that life I just described with running in all these different directions to make it happen, that it's hard for them to really sit down and focus on that one big story like David had a chance to do in Vietnam, or like he did with the economy. I mean, think of the hard work that went into just trying to help us all get our heads around this economy and the reckoning and where it's heading. And I think, I like where you ended up. That's really healthy. I've had much more frustrating moments where I didn't have such a healthy response.
There are lots of fists put through walls in the newsroom. There aren't as many fists as there used to be put through walls, which I think is kind of sad.
Right.
And that shows the state of journalism. That's my definition of the state of journalism today.
And the worst thing to do is to hang up on an editor when you're like on a sat phone. You're not going to get another connection again. You're like, why did I do that? That's the stupidest thing I've ever done. You're in the middle of Afghanistan with a sat phone that's not working that well, and you hang up, and you're like, God, I'm an idiot. But I've had moments of really I think one thing that people don't understand is a lot of foreign correspondents have their families with them. When I lived in Jerusalem with my family, we had our kids, and the bus bombings were going off everywhere. And you're suddenly very connected to the Israeli and the Palestinian people and what they're going through, because in a way you're part of that. You're immersed into it. And I think surreal experiences of, living in Jerusalem, going off into serious fighting in the West Bank, seeing kids shot by Israeli snipers, coming home, coursing past a bus bombing where Israeli civilians have been killed, and you come home for meatloaf. and your little kids are running in the garden, and you're like, you're part of it. And for me, a moment of despair was recognizing that 3 little boys and a bombing right near the kids' school, and the Hamas bombers, excuse me, this is a little gross, but Hamas bombers' brain in the school parking lot. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, we're out. That's it. We've got to go. And it was August of 2001, and we moved to London, and we arrived September 5th, 2001, and I thought, I'm out of the Middle East. And I thought, you know, the movie, Blue Blazer, I'm going to Paris, I'm going to cover London, this is going to be amazing. September 11th happens, of course, the whole world changes, and then you realize that all those things you've covered now really come into sharp focus. You have a chance now to take all that work you've done and bring it to the field. And you know, I love that quote. I've said it now 3 times, so I won't say it again. But that despair can often lead to fate that brings you to the place where you really need to, you know, as Steve said, work hard. Yes, sir.
My name is Ibrahim Khan. I'm a freshman at the college. My question relates to safety. We sort of talked about that in the previous question. How important is the consideration of safety when you're going into a relatively dangerous region and you have a story that you really want to cover, but you know it's sort of unsafe? What sort of a balance do you try to find, and how does that thinking process go along?
Martha, why don't you take that?
I'll take that probably because I've been in the war zones probably most recently. I think you have to be, I always tell people who've not done this before that don't be lulled into your own safety. Have rules, set some lines that you won't cross, because when you get in there, you start forgetting that because you're excited and something's happening and you want to go further and you want to go further. I don't tell my family what I do, and I don't tell them half the stuff that I've done. And I share that a little, I suppose, with the U.S. military, who probably, I have some disadvantage. I remember one day we were rocketed and mortared, and the Marines I was with said, man, I'm not telling my wife about this. You shouldn't tell your husband about this. And I'm like, too bad, it's going to be on TV tonight, so I'm afraid I have to fess up to this one. But I try to be careful and not be crazy. I had a colleague, Bob Woodruff, who was horribly injured. And thank goodness he is doing just great. But it was an amazingly miraculous recovery that Bob went through. And that was really, really hard. I mean, that was hard on me. That was hard on my kids. Because they knew Bob, they knew, my son, who's actually now a freshman in college, I remember then, because he was quite a bit younger, used to kid me that I'd never been an anchor on TV. And Peter Jennings had died the year before, and then Bob Woodruff had been named anchor, and he was an anchor. And in my child's mind, he said to me that Mom, I decided I don't want you to be an anchor anymore. And that to him was how I would stay safe. And that was his sort of coping mechanism. So, I mean, you do think of things like that when you're over there. On the other hand, I have done things that I know I shouldn't have done. And I went into the Swat Valley in Pakistan when the Taliban were controlling huge areas of that. And as a woman, I pretty much stood out like crazy. And no matter how many scarves you put on, you walk 2 feet and they know you're an American. But I mean, that was that moment where you thought, I really need to do this. No one's done this. I need to see this. And, you know, we did it very quickly. I got out and did a stand-up, and we got in the car, and I got out and interviewed a couple of people. We got in the car, and we, you know, drove about 120 miles an hour out of there. In terms of body armor and things like that, I always wear body armor. Peter Jennings used to tease me that I looked like a complete dork in a helmet. And I'm like, too bad, Peter, I'm wearing it wherever I go. And I think you just have to have your own rules about what you'll do. I mean, in Afghanistan now we have security. And in fact, I will take some credit for that because a couple of years ago we were staying at a hotel there, and we started going back and forth to Bagram, which isn't the safest drive, just by ourselves. And we got stopped once by some Afghan police, which was a little nerve-wracking, and I remember calling our foreign editor saying, we should not be traveling along these roads by ourselves. And so you just, I mean, through experience, you try to get better at that. I don't think, I mean, Charlie, I love hearing him say this, that he won't send people who have no war experience to war zones. And after Bob Woodruff was hurt, I said to ABC, and they hadn't really done this before, but don't, and Bob was experienced, but don't send people to war zones who have no experience. And they're like, well, anything can happen. I said, yes, but if you're in a Humvee, you'll know what questions to ask. If you're with people you don't think are doing the right thing, you'll know that. If you're, you know, you just have to have experience, and you gain it, or you talk to people who've been there, so you get better.
I think that this is the thing that keeps me up at night all the time, is that, you know, we're a small news organization with limited resources. We're very stealth, and the thing that is the balance there is we can never be so stealth that we put people at risk. So we have had to be really stringent about being sure that everyone who is in Iraq and Afghanistan for us has hostile environment training, is a serious veteran, and we've had to really cobble together coverage plans that we can afford by being creative, by being very precise, by being sure they check in with us, by making sure we know exactly where they are, and being extremely careful. Because as we build these new models for journalism, the one thing we can't forget is that we got to protect the people in the field. We have to have the resources to be able to do that if we're going to take on the challenge of covering it.
It's enormously expensive, too.
Yes, up here.
Hi, my name is Sennott, and I'm a visiting international student at GSAS. Charles, you talked about the thrilling feeling of having the piece of information that you just knew was going to be sensational and break the news. So I was just curious, and I guess my question goes to all of you. If you ever wondered if you crossed the line, or if you ever ended up not publishing an article because of moral or ethical reasons.
That's a very good question, but we've got a lot of people who want to talk, so I'm just going to ask one of you to respond to it.
Yes, I think that, you know, if you're a good journalist, especially if you're in the investigative realm, I would think you have a better answer for this. I'll just say
okay,
yes.
Well, Steve, why don't you respond to it?
You
Because
know,
this investigative reporting involves
Is the courage.
getting information that somebody does not want you to have.
And the courage to know no matter how hard you've worked, it might not be there.
Exactly.
right, well, there's sort of different kinds of answers to this. I've certainly not written stories that didn't pan out. You know, and I have, and I'm sure Martha and Charlie have as well, from time to time had to withhold stories or details at the request of the American government. That does happen. But I would honestly say sometimes you just have, you know, I usually take a deep breath when I'm about to do something that I know is going to be hurtful to another person and say, well, but we have to do this. I mean, in other words, I've never felt that we had to hold a particular story. We're doing a story right now that's going to appear on Friday at ProPublica, and I could tell you about it, but I'd have to shoot you all. But it is a story where a very decent person in the story doesn't come off that well, and I feel bad about that. But that's not immoral. It's newsworthy. We have to do it. So, but yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes stories don't pan out and you don't publish them. Absolutely.
Yes.
Hi. My name is Blair. I'm from the Ed School, and my question is actually for Charles. You mentioned in your talk that Nikki Cebecky, you were sending her over to Turkey to immerse herself in the culture and the history of the country in order to be a better foreign correspondent. My question is, in the future, in a globalized digital news world, do you think the foreign correspondents will be from that country instead of sent there?
That's a really good question. And we do have many of our correspondents who are from the country and who write for us as well. But one of the things we're trying to do at Global Post is really write to an American audience. And therefore, if you're from that country and you've gone to college in the States or you've lived in the States for a long time, that's great. As long as you know that the NBA matters a lot more than cricket. As long as you know that, you know, you understand if you're going to make a reference to the West Bank, you know, describe it as roughly the size of Rhode Island. You know, I need those touchstones for, we have such an uphill climb to get Americans to care about the world. I've got to have writers who can do that. And I don't care where you're from, as long as you can do that. But we do find that it's really good to have fresh eyes. You know, that's the skill of being the storyteller. We've had people talk about crowdsourcing and about civilian, you know, sort of citizen journalism and how we have to have everyone have equal say. Since prehistoric times, someone had to be the guy who tells the story. There was one guy with a torch who went into the cave and said what's in there and came out and told everyone. They didn't have everyone go in. You know, I really believe that that journalists have a craft for getting it right and telling the story in an interesting way, and that's what we're looking for. And yes, it needs to be told in a way that an American audience can come at it.
Can I tell the Ben Bradley Sr. great line about, he was asked about what he thought about citizen journalists.
This is Ben Bradley.
Ben Bradley Sr., as opposed to your editor.
The Watergate and
yes,
Pentagon
Watergate,
Papers,
the executive
Ben
editor of the
Bradley.
Washington Post, and he said, what do you think about citizen journalists? And he said, well, I don't know, what do you think about citizen surgeons?
You know, just a quick point. That said, one thing we're really interested in and we're really pursuing is finding the top journalists in these countries with whom we can partner. And then it becomes a learning experience. We're really into this model and we're just exploring it right now. Yes?
Hi, my name's Richard Lister. I'm a Neiman affiliate here. And in the real world, I'm a BBC correspondent. I'd be interested in your views on something that David Halberstam obviously loved, which was challenging the conventional wisdom on a story, particularly with the benefit of historical hindsight. Could you talk a little bit about the difficulties that is involved with that, particularly when editors and audiences have a particularly fixed view about something?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good question. There was a period in the late 1980s when a colleague of mine and I were frustrated. We had gone out to do some story and we couldn't get the editors of the desk to pay any attention. And he looked at me and he said, you know, at the New York Times, never be behind, but never be ahead. And you know, and there's this sense that you can circle too far ahead of a story, you know, and it becomes very, very frustrating and lonely. But I think that's where the great journalism is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you define yourself as challenging that conventional wisdom, you're going to find the great journalism. And I think nobody has ever, you know, really changed anyone's mind by doing a slightly different version of the story everyone's already done.
We're running out of time, and I want to get the two other questioners very quickly into the conversation. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Paul Duffy. I'm not a Harvard student, but I am a news junkie dedicated to it. Question for Martha Raddatz, which is, I find your story about Cheney breathtakingly cynical, but not at all surprising. And my wonder is, what do you think is the chemical reaction that produces that moment? Why did it happen with you and not with one of your colleagues? Is it the time of day?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I don't, you know what? I don't know, but I know he walked out of that room and his staff, I know, you could see his staff in the room just go, oh no. And then they'll talk about it. And I know a lot of them, no one was mad at me, which is very interesting. I mean, no one was blaming me for that. It was, well, he was tired, or he'd had a long day, or maybe you misunderstood him. What he meant was, you know, so what's your question? Whatever, I'm just running it the way it was. I don't have to do anything. But I think, you know, there's certainly moments. I mean, I had never interviewed him before. I had covered, if it tells you something about Vice President Cheney, I'd covered the White House 2.5 years and never met him. I mean, so there was that. I think sometimes people go into interviews and they think, oh, this is going to be nothing. You know, it's 10 minutes. Who cares? We happen to be, I think we were in Oman during that interview. I don't know what he'd been doing all day, but I mean, I felt like he had a lot of chances a lot of moments passed where he could have said, let's go back to that, or let me explain further, and he never did.
One last question here.
Hi, I'm Gabriella Romano. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School many years ago, and I'd like to change the subject to something in journalism that I think has been an enormous failure, which is the coverage of climate change. And I wanted to ask Stephen's question about that, which is, what is it going to take for you guys to cover this? We've had a decade of rapidly warming environment and climate catastrophe
we've got your question.
around the globe?
Okay.
Well, first of all, you know, we do cover it, and I think it is being covered. I think, should it be covered more? Absolutely. But my personal view is that the sort of transitional period we're in the world of energy, that we're moving out of this carbon-based economy into something else, is one of the single most important stories of our time. You know, I would challenge you back a little bit and say I think there's an awful lot of coverage of it. I don't think people are ignoring it at all. We're certainly not.
I am sorry to say that we're out of time. I appreciate. I'm sorry, sir, but I hope that you have enjoyed this as much as I have. I think that it's been a great opportunity to honor the tradition and the passion and the spirit of David Halberstam. And panelists, thank you all very, very much. And good night.